Howdy folks, it's me, Josh. The Civil War was a conflict that had been brewing for centuries as the divisions between the North and the South ultimately led the country to explode over the issue of slavery. But this wasn't the first time that something like this had happened in American history. In fact, a version of the Civil War nearly happened 30 years before it broke out in our timeline during what was known as the Nullification Crisis. As I said, the North and the South in the US had been facing divides ever since their inception in the early 17th century. In the North, the Pilgrims first arrived on Plymouth Rock in order to escape religious persecution, and ultimately grew into a mercantile economy with strong relations with Britain, before eventually growing into the industrial center of the United States. In the South, though, the first settlers in Jamestown arrived seeking commercial gain, leading to the growth of tobacco and other cash crops, ultimately leading to the growth of an agrarian commercial economy, which itself led to the rise of slavery in the South as a result. While slavery would eventually grow into an issue itself, the main debate between the North and the South in the early 19th century was actually trade. Since the North was an industrial economy, they relied on protectionist tariffs in order to keep their economy afloat, raising taxes on imported goods in order to encourage domestic manufacturing. However, the South, with its agrarian economy, wasn't able to manufacture goods on its own, and so relied on free trade in order to acquire manufactured goods at a lower cost. In 1828, after being snubbed out of a victory in 1824, Andrew Jackson was once again running for president, expressing support for lowering tariffs, and the Democrats, with a strong voter base in the South, came up with a plan. They would create a tariff so outrageous, placing taxes even on goods created within New England, that New England would have no choice but to refuse, killing the bill, whose failure they could then blame on New England, and then bring the northwestern states to their side and win the election for Jackson. Everything was going according to plan. New England was seeming very opposed to the new bill. But, against all odds, when the bill was voted on, it passed, with many New Englanders saying that they still supported the other tariffs it put in place. And after being passed by the Senate, it was then signed into law by President John Quincy Adams, being dubbed the Tariff of Abominations. Jackson would end up winning the election regardless, but needless to say, the South was pissed about this tariff, particularly one South Carolinian man who had just been elected as Jackson's vice president, John C. Calhoun. Calhoun hated this tariff so much that he even began to float the idea of nullification, the idea that his state could render a national law null and void within its borders if it found it unconstitutional. The issue of states' rights quickly became an issue for debate as nullification began to grow more and more popular within South Carolina. Many people expected Jackson, a Southerner himself, to side with Calhoun, but Jackson, worried about the threat nullification would bring to national cohesion, instead sided against nullification. In 1832, seeing the turmoil that the Tariff of Abominations was causing, Jackson then passed the new Tariff of 1832, which slightly reduced import duties. But this wasn't enough for South Carolina. South Carolina ended up calling a state convention nullifying the new tariff, as Calhoun ended up in a bitter split with Jackson, during which he resigned the vice presidency. Jackson then threatened that if South Carolina didn't accept the tariff, he would enforce it by force, with South Carolina in turn threatening to secede from the Union if Jackson used force. Jackson, furious at this point, threatened that if South Carolina seceded, he would have their whole leadership executed, exclaiming, "John Calhoun, if you secede from my nation, I will secede your head from the rest of your body." Things were escalating fast, and it looked as though the US was on the brink of civil war. But just then, when all hope seemed lost, look, it's a bird, it's a plane, no, it's Henry Clay, and he's here to save the day. Henry Clay did what he did best, coming up with a compromise between Calhoun and Jackson, ultimately creating the Compromise Tariff of 1833, which gradually reduced tariff rates over time. And so, with the issue resolved, South Carolina backed down and the crisis was averted. However, even though the tariff issue was resolved, it didn't fix the long-standing divides between the North and South, as the main issue for debate soon shifted from tariffs to slavery, which would ultimately bring the country to its next great crisis of secession, with Andrew Jackson noting, "The tariff was only a pretext, and disunion and Southern Confederacy the real object. The next pretext will be the slavery question." Though the South seemed intent on secession, many people today are intent on stealing your data. But, thanks to today's sponsor, Atlas VPN, I never have to worry about that again. With just a couple clicks, Atlas lets you instantly guard your device and all of the information that it carries and sets your location to pretty much anywhere in the world, allowing you to access exclusive content as well. But that isn't all. Atlas also blocks any and all malicious links, ads, and trackers, notifies you if someone's trying to steal your data, and gives you protection on unlimited devices from just one subscription. And for the price of only $1.83 per month, with 3 months extra, and a 30-day money-back guarantee, this easily makes Atlas the best VPN on the market. So make sure to go to get.atlasvpn.com/Josh Sullivan History for this amazing deal, and to support my content. And now, back to the video. As South Carolina was on the brink of secession, Jackson was intent on crushing any rebellion that would come his way. But after a miraculous compromise from Henry Clay, South Carolina yielded, averting the crisis. But this deal would only delay what was to come, as secession soon arose just 30 years later. But what if that changed? What if, in an alternate timeline, Henry Clay failed to reach a compromise and South Carolina broke out in revolt? Unlike in the Civil War of our timeline, nullification wasn't popular in the South outside of South Carolina, with many states even denouncing the doctrine. So, upon the revolt, it's very unlikely that any other states would join in on the rebellion. And so, South Carolina finds itself standing alone, waging war against the entire rest of the Union. Just before the revolt would have broken out, South Carolina mobilized a total of 2,000 mounted Minutemen and 25,000 infantry, while the Union had sent warships to the port at Charleston and was capable of mobilizing far more than South Carolina. So, as soon as the revolt breaks out, the Union would shell Charleston, completely destroying the city as Union troops march in across South Carolina's borders, taking the capital within just a few months, leaving immense destruction in their wake as they capture the leaders of the rebellion, executing each and every one of them for treason, placing South Carolina under military occupation. If that sounds a little harsh to you, that's because it is. The reason Jackson would be so harsh against South Carolina would be to shake every state contemplating secession to its core, as the concept soon becomes utterly unthinkable, knowing what would happen to their state if and when secession failed. And after the crisis in our timeline, the idea of nullification, which had been debated in the country ever since the imposition of the Alien and Sedition Acts in the 1790s, was completely killed. And so, with South Carolina seceding and being made an example of before the whole nation, this too would completely kill the idea of secession as other states are intimidated by the federal government. It's possible that a Supreme Court case could end up coming around on the topic of secession, but the Marshall Court, intent on strengthening the federal government at the expense of the states, would very likely deem secession unconstitutional, solidifying the death of any ideas of secession. And although such a ruling would be controversial, the treatment of South Carolina would keep any real pushback from being made for a state's right to secede. Jackson would still likely lower tariffs out of goodwill towards the other southern states, but as time goes on, slavery still becomes a major issue for debate as the rest of the antebellum period goes on in pretty much the exact same way as it did in our timeline. But by the time of Lincoln's victory in 1860, it's very unlikely that the South would secede like they did in our timeline. Secession was already very controversial in the South in our own timeline, with many Southerners not supporting the action. But this time, with the idea of secession much less popular, it's very unlikely that the South secedes, meaning that the Civil War as we know it never happens. With the Civil War avoided and Lincoln still elected, the expansion of slavery is still halted, which would inevitably bring about the end of slavery, with the institution being abolished not long after. However, without secession, the Southern Democrats aren't ostracized like they were in our timeline, and the Democrats managed to maintain a hold on their voter base in the North, keeping the Republicans from having the decades of control over the government they did in our timeline. With radical Republicans being kept from having complete control over the government, the country doesn't see the same expansion of rights to freed slaves, with such measures likely being enacted on a state level instead. The South, though, having seen the inevitability of the abolition of slavery, would have attempted to bargain for a compromise before abolition, likely throwing its support behind the idea of colonization, creating a colony in Africa to which freed slaves could be sent to. Colonization was an idea that was floated around in our timeline, with figures such as Henry Clay supporting it, helping to create the American Colonization Society, or ACS. Many radical abolitionists, though, such as William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass, decried the idea of colonization, but the idea did see enough popularity for the ACS to create a colony in Liberia to send freed slaves to. And though the colony would end up declaring independence in 1847, the US wouldn't recognize its independence until 1862, and only occurred as a result of the removal of Southern Democrats from the government. It's very likely that, if abolition is inevitable, the Democrats would start throwing their support behind ideas of colonization, which would grow in popularity throughout the Deep and Outer South. Radical abolitionists in New England would still oppose colonization, but moderate Republicans would likely support this measure as a way to compromise with the South in order to bring about abolition. And so, with support from the Democrats, and a decent amount of Republicans, it's very possible that the US would begin a state-sponsored colonization effort in Liberia, sending freed slaves there en masse after abolition is enacted. One issue that comes with this, though, is the sheer number of people that would be sent to Liberia. The number of freed slaves in the US vastly outnumbered the population in Liberia, and so the US would need to take on a massive effort on building up enough infrastructure in order to support this population. But even then, it likely wouldn't be enough, with Liberia becoming extremely crowded and the US pushing for expansion of the colony. By the time of the Berlin Conference, it's possible that the US would push for the expansion of Liberia, likely gaining more land further inland in order to suit their needs. With this rapid expansion of the freed slave population in Liberia, the Americo-Liberian population is able to easily overtake the natives, taking control while still under US rule. Back home, US policy would generally continue as it did in our timeline. Westward expansion would likely continue at a similar pace as in our timeline, though the Democrats' push for activity to be done at the state level might end up leading it to progress a bit slower. And as the Democrats continue pushes for free trade, this, combined with their pushes for colonization, would lead them to take on a more interventionist foreign policy. Over time, though, the manufacturing base in the North would inevitably overtake the agricultural economy in the South, as the Northern economy once again dominates the nation. The issue of Liberia would remain, though, with Democrats wanting to keep the colony and Republicans wanting to grant it independence. Inevitably, during a period of Republican control over the government, though, Liberia would eventually be granted its independence. And though the divides between the North and South still linger, the US comes out of this period a much more unified and stable society, and with a strengthened Democrat Party, the South manages to hold on to a great amount of influence over the nation as a whole. Oh, and also, West Virginia never exists, which is probably my favorite part of this entire scenario. Another thanks to Atlas VPN for sponsoring today's video. Make sure to go to get.atlasvpn.com/JoshSullivanHistory for their great deal and to support my content. So I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, make sure to stick around for more. And hey, you could also maybe subscribe or something. So that's it for today's video. Well, till next time, see ya.